I drove 9 hours with a priceless family heirloom for my son's engagement dinner, only to be told it was yesterday. 3 days later he called me screaming because his company card was declined. He asked if I'd forgotten to pay. I calmly told him, "No, I cut you off." This is the story of how I discovered my own son was trying to erase me, and how I took back not just my money, but my entire life. It's a story about toxic family, financial betrayal, and the quiet strength a woman finds when she's been pushed too far. Before we get into the details of this story, I want to thank you for being here. It means the world to me. I'd love to know where you're watching from tonight. Let me know in the comments what city or country you're in, and what time it is for you. It helps me feel a little less alone in all this. Now let's begin. The California sun was a warm, constant presence on my face as I drove, the golden hills of wine country rolling by my window like waves in a slumbering sea. 9 hours of monotonous highway stretched behind me, a ribbon of asphalt I had traveled in joyful anticipation. My lower back ached with a dull, familiar protest, but my heart was light, buoyant with a purpose I hadn't felt in a long time. In the passenger seat, nestled securely in a velvet-lined hand-carved cherrywood box, was a piece of our family's soul. It held the original hand-inked deed to our family's Napa Valley vineyard, signed by my great-grandfather over a century ago in elegant swirling script. Beside it lay a single bottle of wine from that very first harvest, its label yellowed with age, a priceless treasure my late husband, Frank, and I had been saving for an occasion that truly mattered. And what could matter more than our only son, Ethan, getting engaged? Today was the day I would pass this legacy on to him, a tangible link to the generations who had walked this land before him. Ethan had always seemed to love the stories of the vineyard, of how our family had carved something beautiful and lasting from the unforgiving California soil. When he was a boy, he'd follow Frank through the rows of vines, his small hand lost in his father's, his face serious as he learned the names of the grapes, the Cabernet, the Merlot, the Zinfandel. Frank always said the land was in our blood, a current that ran deeper than memory. After Frank passed 2 years ago, the silence he left behind was immense. The weight of that legacy fell to me, and the vineyard became a quiet sanctuary, the only place where I could still feel the echo of his presence in the rustle of the leaves and the warmth of the sun on the earth. I hadn't seen Ethan in nearly 4 months, a fact that sat like a small stone in my chest. Our calls were brief, his voice always rushed, filled with the static of a life moving too fast. He'd mentioned they were planning something small for the engagement. Just family, he'd said. I took him at his word. I trusted him. After all, he was my son. When I finally pulled into the long gravel driveway of the vineyard house, our house, the sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and royal purple. The house looked different, larger somehow and colder. The rambling, chaotic rose bushes I had so lovingly tended had been ripped out, replaced by sharp, minimalist landscaping that looked severe and unwelcoming. Brittany, his fiancée, opened the door. Her smile was a perfect, dazzling work of art, but it faltered for a fraction of a second when she saw me, a tiny crack in a flawless facade. There was no hug, no warm welcome, just a flicker of something I couldn't quite name in her eyes. Annoyance? Panic? "Carol," she said, her voice as smooth and cool as glass. She didn't move from the doorway, her body a slender, impassable barrier. I held up the heavy wooden box, my own smile genuine and wide. "I brought something for the engagement dinner," I said, my voice filled with the joy I'd been carefully carrying for 9 long hours. She paused, tilting her head in a gesture that seemed practiced. The perfect smile returned, but it was hollow, failing to reach her eyes. "Oh," she said, and that single simple word was a pinprick to my heart, deflating all my hope. The dinner was yesterday. I just stood there holding the box. The weight of it suddenly felt immense, unbearable. What do you mean?" My voice sounded distant, thin. She shrugged, a delicate lift of her slender shoulders. "It was all very last minute. My family flew in and it just made sense to do it then. We didn't think you'd be up for the travel on such short notice anyway." Inside I could hear laughter, bright and carefree. Someone clinked a glass in a toast. It was the sound of a celebration, a family gathering I was not a part of. She never moved to let me in. The beautiful, heavy box in my arms felt like a fool's burden. A wave of shame, a shame that wasn't mine but had been handed to me. settled onto my shoulders heavy as a shroud. I asked if I could just come in for a moment to see Ethan to give him my gift. She glanced back into the house, a fleeting, calculating look. Then she turned back to me, her expression a mask of polite regret. Maybe another time. We're still cleaning up. It's just too much right now. And then the door closed. Not slammed but closed with a quiet, decisive click that was somehow more brutal. I stood on my own porch, locked out of my own home, holding a legacy they had already decided I was no longer a part of. I sat in my car, staring at the closed door, not realizing that this wasn't an oversight. It was a declaration of war, and I was about to uncover just how deep their betrayal ran. I don't know how long I sat there in the chilled silence of my car. An hour, maybe more. Time seemed to stretch and warp, each second ticking by with agonizing slowness. The lights in the house glowed with a warm, inviting light, a beacon of a life that no longer included me. I watched silhouettes move past the windows, heard the faint echo of music, but no one came out. Not Ethan. Not even a text message to ask where I was. Nothing. The velvet-lined box sat on the passenger seat beside me, a silent, ornate witness to my utter humiliation. My mind kept replaying the scene at the door, Brittany's cool dismissal, the finality of the click of the latch. I kept thinking of Ethan as a little boy, his face streaked with dirt and tears after he fell from his bike, his arms wrapped tightly around my neck as I comforted him. He loved me then. Or at least I thought he did. Where had that boy gone? Eventually, the engine rumbled to life beneath me, the sound a jarring intrusion into the quiet twilight. I pulled away, the crunch of gravel under my tires sounding like a final mournful goodbye. There's a particular kind of cruelty in being dismissed so politely. It leaves no room for anger, no opening for a fight. It's a smooth, quiet closing of a door in your face that says you are not worth the effort of an argument. Says you are simply irrelevant. I drove until the winding, familiar vineyard roads turned back into the impersonal, glaring stretch of the highway. I had no destination. I just drove. The gas light blinked on, a small, urgent red eye in the darkness, a plea from a machine that had given all it could. I pulled into the first dingy motel I saw, the flickering broken vacancy sign feeling like a judgment on my new status in life. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and the sharp, chemical scent of industrial bleach. The blanket on the bed was thin and scratchy, offering no comfort. I placed the heavy wooden box on the nightstand, unable to even look at it. Felt like an accusation. I didn't cry. The shock was a cold, hard stone in my chest, too dense for tears. It had hardened into something else, a chilling clarity that cut through the fog of my grief. What my son and his fiancée had forgotten, I still remembered. Every sacrifice Frank and I had made for that land. Every late night poring over accounts. Every weekend spent mending fences. Every dollar we had, poured back into the soil. And as I sat there, perched on the edge of that lumpy, unfamiliar motel bed, something began to shift inside me. It was the quiet, dangerous moment when deep, aching sadness begins to curdle and transform into a cold, hard resolve. I started thinking about their lifestyle, a constant parade of luxury I had chosen to ignore. The fancy cars, the designer clothes Brittany flaunted on social media, the expensive dinners with so-called investors. Frank and I had lived modestly, our lives dictated by the needs of the vineyard. How were they affording all of this? And then it hit me. A memory, small but now glaringly significant. A few months ago, Ethan had called me, his voice smooth and persuasive. "Mom, it's just to make things easier," he'd said. "Paying suppliers, handling payroll. Can you add me as a signatory to the main business account? You shouldn't have to worry about the day-to-day stuff." Eager to lessen my own burdens and show my trust in him, I had agreed without a second thought. And with that account came a corporate credit card. A card with a very, very high limit, backed by the full value of our family's life work. My mind raced, connecting the dots with horrifying speed. The new landscaping, Brittany's $5,000 handbag, the last-minute dinner with her family that surely cost a fortune. They weren't just spending the vineyard's profits. They were burning through its foundation. They were treating our family's legacy like their personal limitless piggy bank. My grief had been a blindfold. I had allowed my love for my son to become a liability, a weakness he and his fiancée were ruthlessly exploiting. Sitting there, surrounded by the peeling wallpaper of that cheap motel room, I pulled out my phone. My fingers didn't even tremble. I found the number for the bank's 24-hour corporate service line. A polite, professional voice answered on the second ring. "Hello," I said, my own voice sounding strangely calm, detached, as if it belonged to someone else. "My name is Carol Miller. I am the primary owner and president of Miller Family Vineyards. I need to report a company card as compromised and have it frozen immediately." As I hung up the phone, a strange, chilling calm washed over me. They had closed a door on me, but I had just locked the gate to their entire kingdom. I had no idea my simple phone call would ignite a firestorm just 3 days later. The next 3 days passed in a strange, suspended reality. I didn't go home to Nevada. I couldn't bear the thought of my empty house, a place that would only amplify my loneliness. And I certainly couldn't go back to the vineyard. The thought of that house, my house, feeling like enemy territory was more than I could bear. So I stayed in that anonymous motel, a ghost haunting the edges of my own life. I lived on lukewarm, bitter coffee and dry toast from the Greasy Spoon diner next door. I spent hours just staring out the window, watching strangers come and go, each of them living a life that felt infinitely more real than mine. I finally opened the cherrywood box. I traced the elegant script on the old deed, a testament to a time when honor and a man's word were his bond. I held the ancient bottle of wine, feeling the cool, smooth glass against my palm. This was supposed to be a moment of joy, of transition, of family. Instead, it felt like a funeral. Through it all, my phone remained silent. I didn't hear a single word from Ethan. Not a text message. Not a voicemail. Not even an angry email. It was as if I had simply ceased to exist the moment my car pulled out of his driveway. The silence was his answer. It was louder, more damning than any argument could ever be. It told me everything I needed to know about my place in his new life. I had none. On the third morning, my phone buzzed against the nightstand, the sound of violent, jarring intrusion into the thick quiet of the room. It was him. My heart gave a painful lurch. For one foolish, hopeful moment, I thought maybe he was calling to apologize. Maybe it was all a terrible, tragic misunderstanding. Maybe he had finally come to his senses. I answered, my voice barely a whisper. "Hello." There was no apology. There was no concern. There was only raw, undiluted rage. "Mom, what the hell did you do?" he yelled, his voice tight and frantic, a complete departure from his usual cool demeanor. "The company card won't go through. It keeps getting declined. I'm here at a 5-star restaurant with the investors for the new restaurant project, and I look like a complete, incompetent idiot. Did you forget to pay the bill?" I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting his panic, his entitlement, his fury wash over me without touching the cold, still center of my resolve. The shield of ice that had formed around my heart was now impenetrable. I stood up and walked to the grimy window, looking out at the dusty parking lot without really seeing it. "No, Ethan," I said, my voice as calm and steady as a frozen lake in winter. "I didn't forget to pay anything." "Then what is it?" he demanded, his voice cracking now with a desperate edge that mingled with his arrogance. "Fix it. I need it fixed right now. You have no idea what's on the line here." "I can't fix it," I said. I paused, intentionally letting the silence stretch, letting him dangle in the uncertainty. "Because I'm the one who canceled it." He was quiet for a second, the only sound his ragged breathing. "You what? Why would you do that? Are you trying to ruin me? You've just destroyed a multi-million-dollar deal." I almost laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. His deal. His money. He had completely forgotten who had built the very ground he was so arrogantly standing on. "I canceled it," I said, my voice hardening, each word a carefully placed stone. "Because the engagement dinner was yesterday. For close family. And since I'm clearly not considered close family anymore, I decided I shouldn't be footing the bills for your lavish lifestyle." Then I delivered the final blow. The words I had rehearsed in my head for 3 long, lonely days. "I cut you off, Ethan. Remember." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. It was the sound of a spoiled, entitled child finally having his favorite, most expensive toy taken away. In that singular moment, I felt a flicker of power I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't triumph. It was the grim, grounding power of a woman who had absolutely nothing left to lose. He eventually hung up without another word. The click was loud and final. I knew it wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time since that door closed in my face, I felt like I could finally breathe again. This was a really hard step for me to take. I loved my son, but I was beginning to see the man he had become. It makes me wonder, what would you have done in my shoes? Would you have cut him off, or would you have tried to talk to him first? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. But that silence was just the beginning. What they did next was meant to destroy me completely. After that phone call, a strange sense of clarity settled over me. The fog of grief and confusion had lifted, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. I finally checked out of the motel and began the long drive home. Not to the vineyard, but to my small, quiet house in Nevada, the one Frank and I had bought as our retirement haven, a place to escape the demands of the harvest season. It was supposed to be my safe space. I soon learned that nowhere was safe. The quiet house felt different now, charged with a tense energy. Every photograph on the wall seemed to mock me. There was Ethan at his high school graduation, his arm around me, both of us beaming. There was a family portrait from years ago. Frank's warm smile, a painful reminder of what I had lost, and what Ethan had so carelessly thrown away. The memories were tainted, viewed now through the lens of this new, ugly reality. My conversation with Ethan had been a declaration of war. I knew I couldn't afford to be a passive victim anymore. It was no longer just about a missed dinner party or a canceled credit card. It was about years of being slowly, methodically, and intentionally pushed aside, devalued, and exploited. I spent the next week with the singular, obsessive focus of a detective. I became an archaeologist, digging through the layered ruins of my own misplaced trust. I started with the finances. I pulled out years of bank statements, tax returns, and personal records. The first thing that stood out were the loans. There were two of them, both significant. One for $50,000 to supposedly upgrade the vineyard's outdated irrigation system. Another for $75,000 to rebrand the wine labels for a younger market. I remembered Ethan's impassioned pleas, the slick, professional-looking business plans he'd shown me. He had made it sound so crucial, so vital to the future of our legacy. I had transferred the money from my personal savings, money Frank and I had carefully set aside, believing I was investing in our family's future. But as I painstakingly cross-referenced those dates with the vineyard's official expense reports, a sick feeling grew in the pit of my stomach. There was no record of any such upgrades. No invoices from irrigation companies. No payments to graphic design firms. The money had simply been transferred into the main business account and then had vanished, siphoned off through 100 smaller transactions. 5-star hotels, designer boutiques, cash withdrawals in Las Vegas. There was no loan agreement, just a mother's faith. A faith he had systematically plundered. Then I went online. It was a masochistic exercise, but a necessary one. Brittany's social media was a perfectly curated gallery of their flawless, expensive life. Trips to Europe, front row seats at fashion shows in New York, ski weekends in Aspen. I scrolled back, my stomach churning with a mixture of disgust and sorrow. And then I saw it. An album from last Thanksgiving, proudly titled "Family is Everything." There was a picture of their whole group. A dozen people smiling and laughing around a lavishly decorated table. I remembered that day. I had been there. I had spent 2 days cooking half the meal. But in the main group photo she posted, the one with hundreds of likes and fawning comments, I wasn't there. I zoomed in, my heart pounding. The edge of the frame was slightly blurry, unnaturally so. She hadn't just chosen a photo I happened to not be in. She had deliberately, carefully cropped me out. It was a small thing in the grand scheme of things, a digital snip, but it felt like a knife to the heart. It was a quiet, insidious erasure. The more I dug, the uglier the picture became. I found old emails between Ethan and a commercial realtor about selling a small, unused plot of land at the far edge of the vineyard property. He had told me at the time that they were just getting it appraised for insurance purposes. The emails revealed he had been actively trying to sell it behind my back for months. He couldn't finalize the sale because my name was still on the primary deed of the entire property, but the intent was there. Cold, calculating, and dripping with greed. Each new discovery was a fresh wound. Another layer of betrayal. I felt like a fool. A naive, grieving widow who had been too lost in her own sorrow to see the vultures circling her own home. They hadn't just been disrespectful. They had been plotting. This wasn't a sudden change in my son's character. It was the slow, horrifying unveiling of who he had truly become. A man who saw his own mother not as family, but as an obstacle. An obstacle standing between him and the life of effortless luxury he felt he deserved. Piece by piece, the puzzle of their deceit was coming together. I felt a cold dread creep over me as I realized the full extent of their betrayal. But the most horrifying piece was still hidden, locked away in a safe I hadn't opened since Frank passed. What I was about to find would change everything. The safe was in Frank's old study, tucked away in the back of his closet, behind a row of old jackets that still faintly smelled of him, a scent of cedar, earth, and old spice. It had been his domain, a place of quiet work and careful, meticulous planning. My hand trembled as I spun the familiar combination, our anniversary. The heavy steel door clicked open with a satisfying thud, releasing the musty scent of old paper and leather, the smell of a life's history. Inside were neat stacks of files, deeds, stock certificates, and investment portfolios, the carefully constructed architecture of the life Frank and I had built together brick by brick. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I still didn't know what I was looking for, exactly. It was more of a feeling. A cold, nagging suspicion that the worst was yet to come, that the betrayals I had already uncovered were merely the surface tremors before the real earthquake. I bypassed the thick files for the vineyard. Maria would later confirm my name was secure on that primary deed, an asset too large and complex to steal so easily. My eyes landed on a slimmer, less imposing folder, labeled simply with one word: Carmel. It was our beach house. A small, charming cottage perched on a cliff in Carmel by the sea that Frank had inherited from his parents. It was our sanctuary, our escape from the relentless demands of the vineyard. It was a place of happy, sun-drenched memories, of chilly morning walks on the foggy beach, of evenings spent on the porch listening to the crashing waves, of teaching a young Ethan how to skip stones across the water. It was legally in both of our names, which meant it became solely and completely mine after Frank passed. It was separate from the business, a piece of our personal life, something I thought was untouched and sacred. With a deep breath, I opened the folder. The original deed was on top, the paper yellowed and soft with age. Beneath it were property tax receipts from the last 20 years and our current insurance documents, all in my name. Everything seemed to be in perfect order. I was about to close the folder, a wave of profound relief washing over me, when my fingers brushed against a single crisp sheet of paper tucked into the very back flap. It was different from the others. The paper was newer, stiffer, the print sharp and modern. It was a quitclaim deed, a legal document used to quickly transfer property ownership from one person to another. My eyes scanned the page, my breath catching in my throat, my blood turning to ice in my veins. The property address was for our Carmel house. The transfer was from me, Carol Miller, the grantor, to a grantee I had never heard of, E&B Coastal Properties LLC. My mind reeled. E&B. Ethan and Brittany. Then I saw it. At the bottom of the page, above the typed words Carol Miller, grantor, was a signature. It was supposed to be my signature. It was a decent forgery, I had to admit. The loops and curls were almost right, the slant was close. But it was flat, lifeless. It lacked the familiar, confident flow of my own hand. It was the signature of a stranger. Beside it was the embossed, official-looking stamp of a notary public I didn't know, from a town in Southern California I'd never even visited. And the date on the document was the final, brutal twist of the knife. It was dated just 6 months after Frank died. A time when I was a ghost, lost in a fog of grief so thick I barely knew what day it was. A time when I was signing papers for the estate, for insurance for the funeral home. A time when I was at my most vulnerable, my most broken. I sank into Frank's old leather chair, the document shaking uncontrollably in my hand. They had stolen it. They had stolen our house. The place where Frank and I had dreamed of growing old. The place where I thought I would one day watch my grandchildren build sandcastles on the shore. They had taken my darkest moment of grief and used it as an opportunity. They had waited until I was shattered, and then they had struck, forging my name to steal a piece of my heart, a piece of my soul. This wasn't about money anymore. This was a violation of the deepest, most profound kind. They hadn't just stolen a house, they had stolen memories. They had desecrated the sacred ground of my life with Frank. My hands were shaking not with sadness, but with a pure cold clarifying rage. They hadn't just disrespected me, they had committed a crime. I picked up the phone, my mind clear on what I had to do next. It was time to fight back. The next morning, I was in the car before the sun had even begun to kiss the horizon. The briefcase sat on the passenger seat like a silent, grim companion. It held the forged deed and the mountain of financial evidence I'd collected. My destination was San Francisco, and my purpose was singular: to find an army. I was heading to the office of Maria Garcia, a lawyer my best friend's daughter, a paralegal herself, had recommended with a tone of reverence. "She's a shark in a designer suit," she had said. "She doesn't just fight for her clients. She decimates the opposition. She specializes in complex family law and financial disputes. She is exactly what you need." Her office was on one of the top floors of a glittering skyscraper, a palace of glass and steel with a panoramic view of the bay that probably cost more than my first car. I felt small and out of place in the opulent waiting room, a grieving widow from Nevada caught in a world of corporate deceit and unimaginable betrayal. But the moment Maria Garcia walked into the conference room, some of that intimidating fear began to subside. She was younger than I expected, maybe in her late 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through you. She was impeccably dressed, but there was a fire in her gaze that had nothing to do with fashion. She shook my hand firmly, her grip surprisingly strong. "Carol, thank you for coming in," she said, her voice calm and direct. "Please tell me everything. Start from the very beginning." There was no small talk, no wasted time, no hollow expressions of sympathy. She was all business. I laid it all out for her, my voice surprisingly steady as I recounted the story. The 9-hour drive, the closed door, the canceled credit card, the cropped photograph, the missing loans, and finally, the forged deed to my Carmel house. I pushed the document across the vast, polished mahogany table towards her. She read it in complete silence, her expression unreadable, a perfect poker face. But I saw a muscle tighten in her jaw, a subtle but telling sign of her rising indignation. When she finished, she looked up at me, and for the first time I saw the shark. It was a flicker of controlled fire in her eyes, a promise of the fight to come. "This is more than a messy family dispute, Carol," she said, her voice calm but edged with steel. "This is felony fraud. Forgery, wire fraud, and given the circumstances of your grief, a clear case of elder financial abuse. They're not just greedy, they're sloppy. They've left a trail a mile wide." For the next hour, she dissected my story with the precision of a surgeon, asking sharp, specific questions that I hadn't even thought to ask myself. She had me sign a stack of release forms, giving her carte blanche to dig into their finances, the shell company, everything. She explained that EMB Coastal Properties was a classic tool for money laundering and hiding assets. As she worked, she made a few calls, her language shifting into a rapid-fire legal shorthand. I heard snippets of her conversation with a forensic accountant she had on retainer. "Leveraged," she said into the phone. "I want to know what the property was leveraged for, and when." She hung up and turned back to me, her face grim. "It's exactly as I suspected," she said. "They didn't just steal the house to own it. They used it. A property like that in Carmel with no mortgage is prime collateral. They've taken out a massive business loan against it." My heart sank. "What for?" "You mentioned Ethan was panicked about a restaurant project when he called you?" I nodded, the memory of his arrogant, fearful voice still fresh in my mind. "My guess is that's it," Maria said, her fingers tapping a decisive rhythm on the table. "They used your home, your memories, to fund their vanity project. And they did it by committing a federal crime." I felt a wave of nausea. They hadn't just stolen from me. They had gambled with my life, with Frank's legacy, risking it all on a restaurant of all things. Leaving Maria's office, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, replaced by a grim sense of purpose. I wasn't alone in this anymore. I had a shark on my side. We had a plan. But I had no idea that Ethan and Brittany had a plan of their own, one far more sinister and cruel than simply stealing property. The week after I hired Maria was a whirlwind of structured activity. Her team moved with a terrifying efficiency that was both daunting and deeply reassuring. They subpoenaed bank records from a half-dozen institutions. They hired a private investigator to track down the notary public whose stamp was on the forged deed. They started building a mountain of evidence so high and so solid that I finally allowed myself a sliver of hope. I thought the worst was over. I thought the fight, as difficult as it would be fought on my terms in a courtroom with facts and evidence as my weapons. I was so terribly wrong. The official-looking cream-colored envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning. It wasn't from Maria. The return address was the Superior Court of California. My hands trembled so violently I could barely tear it open. The legal jargon was dense and confusing, a forest of unfamiliar terms. But the words that jumped out at me from the page felt like physical blows, knocking the air from my lungs. Petition for conservatorship. I read it again and then a third time, my mind refusing to comprehend what my eyes were seeing. My son, Ethan Miller, and his fiancée, Brittany Clark, were formally petitioning the court to grant them conservatorship over me, Carol Miller, and my entire estate. They were trying to have me legally declared mentally incompetent. They were trying to strip me of my rights, my freedom, my very personhood. The document itself was a masterpiece of insidious cruelty, a tapestry woven from grotesque half-truths and outright poisonous lies. It painted a picture of a grieving widow who had lost her grip on reality. It claimed that since Frank's death, I had been suffering from increasing paranoia, significant memory loss, and dangerously erratic behavior. My decision to freeze the company credit card was cited as a prime example of my financial impulsiveness and inability to grasp complex business realities. My recent requests for old bank statements from the vineyard were twisted into evidence of an unhealthy, paranoid obsession with the past. The most vile distortion was their description of the night of the engagement party. They claimed I had shown up unannounced and disoriented, that I had been confused about the date and time, and that my agitated state had been deeply concerning to them. They were twisting their cruelty into my supposed incompetence. The final page was the ultimate betrayal, the kill shot they had saved for last. It was a signed, notarized declaration from a psychologist I had never met, a Dr. Alistair Finch. He claimed to have had a thorough consultation with Ethan and Brittany regarding my mental state. Based solely on their self-serving descriptions of my behavior, he had concluded with sickening professional authority that I was a potential danger to my own financial and personal well-being, and strongly recommended a full court-ordered psychiatric evaluation. They had found a hired gun, a so-called professional willing to sell his credentials and his ethics to help them steal everything from me. I held the letter, the paper trembling in my hands as if it were alive with venom. I collapsed into a kitchen chair, the document spread out before me like a death sentence. This was their counterattack, their scorched earth strategy. It wasn't just about the money or the property anymore. This was an attempt to utterly discredit me, to destroy my credibility, to shatter my sanity in the eyes of the law and the world. If they succeeded, I would have no power to fight them. I would be a prisoner in my own life, a ward of the court, and my son, my own child, would hold the keys to my cage. They weren't just trying to steal my assets anymore. They were trying to steal my identity, my sanity, my very voice. They wanted to erase me. My first call was to Maria. I read her the petition over the phone, my voice breaking with a mixture of terror and rage. She was silent for a long moment after I finished. Then she said, her voice colder and harder than I had ever heard it. "Okay, Carol. They've just made the biggest mistake of their lives. They've declared all-out war. And they have no idea who they're messing with." But as I hung up, a chilling thought crept in. They forgot one thing about my husband, Frank. And I prayed to a God I wasn't sure I believed in anymore that it would be enough to save me. The petition for conservatorship sent a shockwave through my life, a malicious legal maneuver designed to shatter my confidence and isolate me completely. And for a few terrifying days it worked. I felt a profound sense of despair, a fear so deep and visceral it was paralyzing. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. My own home, which was once my sanctuary, now felt like a cage. I would second-guess every decision I made. Did I leave the stove on? Did I remember to lock the door? They had planted a seed of doubt in my mind, and it was starting to take root. How could I fight this? It was my word, the word of a grieving widow, against a doctor's professional declaration and the heartfelt, tearful concern of my only son. I felt the walls closing in and I was suffocating. Just when I was at my absolute lowest, convinced I was going to lose everything, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, an Oregon area code. I almost didn't answer, but some instinct made me swipe the screen. "Carol," a familiar voice said. A voice I hadn't heard in almost a year. It was Diane, Frank's younger sister. We hadn't spoken much since the funeral. She lived a quiet life up in Oregon, a painter, and we had unintentionally drifted apart, both lost in our own separate oceans of grief. "Diane," I managed to say, my voice thick with unshed tears. "I heard," she said, her voice gentle but underlined with a firm resolve that was so much like her brother's. "My friend Sheila in Napa is a court clerk. She saw the filing. She called me immediately. I'm so sorry, Carol. I'm so sorry you're going through this. I'm getting in my car right now. I'll be there tomorrow morning." I protested, a feeble attempt at self-sufficiency. I told her she didn't have to, that it was a long drive, that I was fine. But she cut me off, her voice unwavering. "Frank would never forgive me if I let you go through this alone. He would haunt me from here to eternity. Besides, there's something I need to give you. Something Frank gave me a long time ago for a day like this." The next morning, Diane's dusty Subaru pulled into my driveway. Seeing her was like seeing a piece of Frank again. She had his kind, intelligent eyes and his no-nonsense demeanor. We hugged for a long time on my front porch, and I finally let myself cry, releasing the pent-up fear and white-hot anger I'd been holding inside for days. She just held me, patting my back, letting me fall apart in a way I hadn't allowed myself to since Frank died. After I had calmed down, she led me to the kitchen table and made us both a cup of tea, moving around my kitchen with a familiar, comforting ease. "Carol, before Frank passed, he was worried," she began, her expression serious as she sat down across from me. "He loved Ethan with all his heart, but he wasn't blind. He saw the way Brittany was influencing him, the way her eyes would light up when she talked about money. He saw the greed starting to take root in our boy, like a poison ivy vine." My heart ached, hearing my own deepest fears echoed in her words. It was a painful validation. "He told me he was afraid that once he was gone, Ethan might try to take advantage of you, to take more than his share, especially if he thought you were vulnerable in your grief." Diane reached into her worn leather purse and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. My name was written on the front in Frank's familiar, steady, all-caps handwriting. It was like a message from a ghost. "He gave me this about a month before he died," Diane said, her voice soft with memory. "He made me promise I wouldn't give it to you unless things got really bad. He said, 'Give this to her if Ethan ever makes her feel like she needs an army. This is her army.'" She gently pushed the envelope across the table to me. "I think now's the time." My fingers trembled as I took it. It felt heavy, filled with more than just paper. It felt like it held the weight of Frank's love, his foresight, his final act of protection. I didn't know what was inside, but as I looked at Diane's kind, determined face, I felt a surge of strength I hadn't felt in weeks. Frank had seen this coming. He had known. And he had prepared for it. With trembling fingers, I broke the seal on the envelope. Inside was a letter in Frank's familiar handwriting, and another thick legal document. What I read on that page made my blood run cold with shock, then hot with a righteous burning fire. The game had just changed completely. I unfolded the letter first, my eyes drinking in the familiar loops and confident strokes of Frank's handwriting. It felt as if he were in the room with me. "My dearest Carol," it began. "If you are reading this, it means my worst fears have come to pass, and our son has let his ambition cloud his love for you. First, let me say I am so sorry. I am sorry you have to face this alone, and I am sorry for my part in not stopping the man he was becoming. But please know you are not alone. I am with you in these pages, and I have made sure, with every legal tool at my disposal, that you are protected." He wrote about his boundless love for me, for the life we had built together, for the vineyard that was as much a child to us as Ethan was. But then the tone shifted, becoming pragmatic and sharp, the voice of the shrewd businessman I knew so well. "I have seen the way Brittany looks at our home, at our legacy, not with the love of a future daughter, but with the avarice of a conqueror. And I have seen how Ethan changes when she is near, how he puffs up, how he talks about expansion and leverage instead of heritage and quality. Love is a powerful thing, Carol, but so is greed. I could not leave you to face that greed unprotected. That is why I had to take these steps, to protect what we built, and more importantly my love, to protect you. Beneath the letter was a thick, professionally bound legal document. The title at the top, embossed in gold lettering, read, "The Frank and Carol Miller Irrevocable Trust." My breath hitched in my throat. I knew we had a standard family trust, a revocable one that outlined how our assets would be divided after we were both gone. But this was different. An irrevocable trust was a fortress. I scanned the pages, my eyes flying across the dense legal terminology. My recent crash course with Maria had made me fluent enough to understand exactly what I was seeing. 2 months before he passed, Frank, along with our longtime and most trusted estate lawyer, had secretly created this new, ironclad, unchangeable trust. He had then quietly legally transferred 2 key assets into it, our beloved Carmel Beach house and most importantly the majority controlling interest, a full 51%, of the Miller Family Vineyards Corporation. The trust named me as the sole lifetime beneficiary, giving me complete and total control, as well as all profits generated from those assets, for the rest of my life. Upon my passing, the assets would then be managed by a professional trustee for the benefit of any future grandchildren. Ethan was named only as a potential, distant beneficiary, with absolutely no control whatsoever, his hands legally tied. And the primary trustee, the person legally bound to protect the trust with fiduciary duty? Me. With Diane named as the immediate successor trustee should anything happen to me. It was a masterstroke of legal strategy, a silent, invisible fortress built around the core of our life's work. This single document rendered Ethan's forged deed to the Carmel house completely and utterly worthless. He had forged my signature to transfer a property that legally wasn't mine to give away. It already belonged to the trust. He had stolen nothing but a piece of paper, committing a felony for a worthless document. The 51% controlling interest in the vineyard meant that even though he was the CEO running the daily operations, I held the ultimate power. I could fire him with a single phone call. I could overrule any decision he made. I could sell the entire vineyard out from under him if I chose to. His entire claim to power, his entire empire was a sham. And the petition for conservatorship? It was now a laughable, pathetic joke. How could they possibly claim I was financially incompetent when my husband's last legal act was to entrust me with the sole, absolute control of our entire legacy? This document was more than just protection, it was a testament. It was Frank's final, resounding vote of confidence in me. They thought they were playing chess, moving their pawns to trap the queen. But my husband, my brilliant, loving husband, had already checkmated them from beyond the grave. Now, holding the ultimate trump card, it was my turn to make a move. Armed with Frank's final gift, I felt a surge of power and clarity I hadn't known I possessed. The fear that had been my constant companion for weeks was gone, burned away by a cold, righteous fury. This wasn't just about defending myself anymore. It was about honoring my husband. It was about protecting the life we had built together. My first call was to Maria. I explained the existence of the irrevocable trust, my voice steady and firm. There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line, followed by a low whistle of admiration. "My God, Carol," she said, her voice filled with a new level of respect. "Your husband was a brilliant, brilliant man. This doesn't just change everything. This ends everything for them. Their conservatorship case is dead on arrival, and our fraud case just became a slam dunk." Maria, with a palpable sense of glee, immediately filed a motion to dismiss their ridiculous conservatorship petition, attaching a certified copy of the trust as the primary exhibit. She also sent a brutally worded letter to their lawyer, informing him that not only were we proceeding with civil charges for fraud and forgery, but that we were also handing over all evidence, including the notary's confession which had just come in, to the district attorney's office to pursue criminal charges. The tide hadn't just turned. It was about to become a tsunami that would wash their entire world away. But I knew I had to face them myself. I couldn't hide behind Maria's legal firepower. I needed to look my son in the eye and let him know that I knew everything. I needed him to see that the meek, grieving woman he thought he could swindle was gone for good. I called Ethan. My voice was calm and commanding, a tone he hadn't heard from me in years. "We need to talk," I said. "Be at the Vineyard House tomorrow at noon. And bring Brittany." He started to argue, to bluster, but I cut him off with 2 sharp words. "Be there." The next day I walked into that house, my house, for the first time since they had shut the door in my face. The air was thick with tension. They were waiting for me in the formal living room, their faces a carefully composed mixture of arrogance and anxiety. They probably thought this was a negotiation, that I was coming to beg or to bargain. They had no idea they were walking into their own execution. Ethan started first, his tone oozing with the same false syrupy concern he had used in his court filing. "Mom, we're glad you agreed to talk," he began, gesturing to the sofa. "We're just so worried about you. This whole legal thing is completely unnecessary. We're family. We can sort this out without lawyers." Brittany chimed in, her voice dripping with saccharine sweetness that made my skin crawl. "We only want what's best for you, Carol. To make sure you're taken care of, that the estate is managed properly." I let them finish their pathetic performance. I listened to their web of lies, their grotesque pantomime of love and concern. My silence seemed to unnerve them, their words trailing off into the heavy quiet of the room. When they were done, I didn't say a word. I simply reached into my briefcase and pulled out 2 documents. I placed the first one, a copy of the forged deed to the Carmel house, on the polished coffee table between us. "This," I said, my voice low, even and dangerous, "is a felony." Brittany paled, her perfect smile vanishing. Ethan's jaw clenched, a muscle pulsing in his cheek. "And this," I continued, placing the thick, bound document from Frank right beside it, "is the Frank and Carol Miller Irrevocable Trust. I believe it predates your little forgery by several months." I let them read the title. I watched the dawning horror in their eyes, the slow, agonizing collapse of their entire world. Ethan picked it up with a shaking hand, his face turning ashen as he scanned the first page. Brittany leaned over his shoulder, her perfectly made-up face contorting into a mask of pure, ugly disbelief and impotent rage. "This is impossible," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "Oh, it's very possible," I said, finally standing up, feeling taller than I had in years. "It's ironclad. Frank protected me. He protected our legacy from you." I looked directly at my son, the boy I had raised, the man who had become a complete stranger to me. "You tried to have me declared incompetent," I said, each word a sharp, clean cut. "You forged my name. You stole from me while I was at my weakest, grieving for your father." I took a step closer. "You didn't just disrespect me, Ethan. You tried to erase me. For what? A restaurant? A bigger house? Was it worth it?" I walked to the door, leaving them there with the ruins of their plans. "The game is over," I said, my voice echoing in the silent room. "Maria will be in touch with your lawyer regarding the criminal proceedings. And as for my property, I am giving you 60 days to vacate. The vineyard is now under my direct control. Pack your things." Their carefully constructed house of cards was collapsing around them. I had given them 60 days out of a foolish, lingering sense of maternal duty. But their nightmare was only just beginning. The 60 days that followed were a quiet, methodical and brutal dismantling of the life Ethan and Brittany had built on a foundation of lies and stolen dreams. As soon as Maria officially notified the bank and their restaurant investors of the fraudulent collateral, my Carmel house, which was safely and legally locked away in Frank's trust, the dominoes began to fall, one by one, each with a resounding crash. The bank, facing the reality that their multi-million-dollar loan was completely unsecured, immediately froze all of Ethan's accounts and called in the entire loan, demanding immediate repayment. The investors, a group of wealthy and influential people from San Francisco, were furious. Realizing they had been duped into partnering with a con man, they pulled out of the restaurant deal and promptly filed their own multi-million-dollar lawsuit against Ethan and Brittany personally for fraud and misrepresentation. The glamorous restaurant project, the centerpiece of their stolen empire, evaporated into a black hole of debt and litigation. While all of this was unfolding in the corporate world, Maria received an unexpected and very welcome phone call. It was from a woman named Mrs. Gable, my former next-door neighbor at the vineyard. She was a notorious busybody, a woman whose curtains were always twitching, but for once her nosiness proved to be a godsend. She told Maria that she had been wanting to call me for months, but didn't want to get involved in family matters. The news of the conservatorship filing, however, had made her furious. She told Maria that she had seen a man visit Ethan and Brittany late one evening about a year ago. She thought it was odd because the man looked nervous and disheveled, and they met him out on the patio in the dark instead of inviting him into the house. He had only stayed for about 10 minutes. But Mrs. Gable had a new security camera, and she remembered the make and model of his car, and even got a partial license plate. Maria's investigator ran the partial plate. It took him less than a day to identify the car as belonging to the very same notary public whose stamp was on the forged deed. He lived 3 towns over and had a history of disciplinary actions from the state. When confronted by the investigator with security footage stills, the date, and the threat of a long prison sentence for felony fraud, the notary crumbled. He admitted in a sworn, videotaped affidavit that Ethan had paid him $5,000 in cash to come to the house late at night and illegally notarize a document without the signatory me being present. He had been told I was ill and had pre-signed the document. It was the final irrefutable nail in their legal coffin. The news of their spectacular downfall spread like wildfire through the small, tight-knit community of Napa Valley. People I had known for years would stop me in the grocery store or at the post office, their eyes filled with a mixture of sympathy for me and disgust for my son. They had all seen the flashy cars and heard the boasts about the big restaurant deal, and now they understood where it had all come from. I didn't gloat. There was no joy, no sense of triumph in watching my son's life implode. There was only a profound and hollow sadness for the boy he used to be, and the greedy, empty man he had chosen to become. I saw them only once during that time. I had to go to the house to retrieve some of Frank's personal effects from the study. Their life was packed into cardboard boxes, a chaotic jumble of expensive, meaningless clutter. Brittany wouldn't even look at me, her face a mask of sullen resentment. Ethan just stood there amidst the boxes, his shoulders slumped, a stranger in his own home. He looked defeated. He looked small. They had tried to take everything from me, and in the end, they were left with nothing but crushing debt and public disgrace. As they packed their final boxes on the 59th day, I felt no joy, only a profound sadness for the son I had lost. But my own story, I was beginning to realize, was far from over. I just want to take a moment and thank you for sticking with me through this. It's a long and difficult story to tell, and recounting these details isn't easy. If you're still here with me, if you're invested in this journey, could you do me a favor and comment with the number 1? It just helps me know that I'm not talking into the void, and that my story is resonating with you. Thank you. Now let's get to what happened next. After Ethan and Brittany were gone, a deep, unnerving quiet settled over the vineyard. The silence was heavier than it had been even in the raw, early days after Frank's death. I walked the rows of vines, the gnarled ancient plants like old friends. I ran my hands over the rough bark, the same way I had seen Frank do 1,000 times. The land was safe, the legacy was secure, but the victory felt profoundly hollow. I had won the battle, but in the process I had irrevocably lost my son. The sprawling house, once filled with laughter and love, was now just a house again. A beautiful empty shell filled with ghosts and painful memories. I knew I couldn't stay there. It was no longer a home, it was a crime scene. I retreated to the Carmel house, our true sanctuary. I let the relentless, cleansing rhythm of the ocean soothe my bruised and battered soul. It was there, sitting on the wide front porch watching the sunset paint the Pacific in strokes of gold and lavender, that I realized my fight couldn't, and shouldn't end with me. The brutal, vicious nature of the petition for conservatorship had ripped the veil from my eyes. It had opened my eyes to a terrifying, hidden world I never knew existed. How many other women, how many mothers and grandmothers, were out there facing similar betrayals? Women who weren't as lucky as I was? Women who didn't have a brilliant, forward-thinking Frank to protect them from beyond the grave, or the financial resources to hire a powerhouse lawyer like Maria. I thought of the quiet, sad stories I'd heard whispered over the years in my community, stories I had listened to with sympathy but had never truly understood. There was my friend Margaret, whose son had convinced her to co-sign a business loan and then defaulted, forcing her to sell her home of 50 years. There was an acquaintance from my book club, whose daughter had slowly drained her retirement account, claiming each withdrawal was a loan she would pay back. These women were often isolated by shame, silenced by a misplaced sense of family loyalty, their grief and trust weaponized against them by the very people who were supposed to love and protect them. A new purpose began to take shape in my mind, A purpose so clear and bright it felt like a calling. It wasn't enough to just protect my own legacy. I had to use my experience, my resources to help other women protect theirs. I called Maria, but not as a client. I called her as a potential partner. I told her my idea. A nonprofit foundation dedicated to providing free legal aid, financial literacy workshops, and a network of emotional support for seniors, particularly women, who were facing financial abuse and exploitation from their own families. Maria was silent for a moment on the other end of the line, and then I heard the genuine smile in her voice. "Carol," she said, "that's the best, most necessary idea I've ever heard. I'm in." Next, I called Diane, who immediately and enthusiastically agreed to leave her quiet life in Oregon to serve on the board of directors. We made a series of big decisions. We would sell my small house in Nevada and use the proceeds, along with a significant portion of the vineyard's annual profits, as the seed money for our new venture. I insisted it wouldn't be named after me. It would be named after the man whose foresight and love had made it all possible. We called it the Franklin Legacy Foundation. Our mission was simple but profound: to be the army for women who felt they had no one left to fight for them. We rented a small, unassuming office space in a downtown community center. A place that was accessible by bus and not intimidating like a corporate law office. Maria recruited a team of retired lawyers, forensic accountants, and paralegals to volunteer their time. Diane, with her calm and compassionate nature, set up a peer-led support group. We started small with a simple flyer at the local library, the senior center, and in church bulletins. The first call came from a woman named Margaret, whose grandson had stolen her identity to open a dozen credit cards in her name. She spoke in a whisper, her voice thick with terror and shame. I just listened, letting her pour out the story she had held inside for years. For the first time, she was heard. By the end of the week, we had a dozen more calls, each story more heartbreaking than the last. The floodgates had opened. We had uncovered a silent, hidden epidemic of pain, and our little foundation was about to become a lighthouse. The Franklin Legacy Foundation grew with a speed and intensity that none of us could have anticipated. What started as a small, quiet office became a bustling, vibrant hub of activity. It was a place of quiet, determined courage. Women would walk through our doors with their shoulders stooped, their eyes downcast, carrying heavy folders thick with confusing legal documents and hearts even heavier with betrayal. They would leave standing a little taller, their steps a little lighter, armed with knowledge, a plan, and the profound, comforting realization that they were not alone, and they were not crazy. We held weekly workshops on topics that seemed simple, but were life-changing for our clients. We taught them how to spot the warning signs of financial abuse, how to read a bank statement and spot irregularities, how to understand the difference between a power of attorney and a joint bank account. Maria and her incredible team of volunteer lawyers held free legal clinics twice a month, untangling the complex, sticky webs of deceit their families had spun around them. They helped women file restraining orders, reclaim stolen property, and navigate the intimidating labyrinth of the court system. But the most powerful and transformative thing we did was simply create a safe space where these women could tell their stories without fear of shame or judgment. The support group, led by the endlessly patient and empathetic Diane, became the true heart of our foundation. It was a sacred space, a place of tears and righteous anger, but also, surprisingly, a place of deep, healing laughter and newfound, fierce friendships. These women, who had been isolated by their own families, were now building a new family, one based on shared experience and mutual respect. About 6 months after we opened our doors, a young reporter from the local newspaper, a thoughtful woman named Sarah, asked if she could sit in on one of our support group meetings. She promised to keep everyone anonymous, to only tell the story of the foundation's work. The women agreed. The article she wrote was beautiful, poignant, and powerful. She didn't focus on the sordid, painful details of the abuse. Instead, she focused on the incredible resilience, intelligence, and grace of the women she met. She called the foundation a lighthouse for mothers in the storm. That article changed everything. Donations, small and large, started pouring in. More volunteers, therapists, financial planners, social workers called, offering their services pro bono. But the most significant consequence came in the form of an unexpected phone call. It was from a producer at the local public television station. They were producing a special segment for their evening news magazine called Community Heroes, and they wanted to feature the work of the foundation. They wanted to interview me on camera. The thought sent a wave of pure terror through me. My battle with Ethan had been a private, agonizing war. Going on camera felt like tearing open a healing wound and exposing it to the whole world. I had no desire to be a public figure. But then I thought of Margaret and Judith, and the dozens of other women who had walked through our doors. Their stories deserved to be heard. My fear, my desire for privacy, was less important than their desperate need for a voice. So I said yes. A week later, I found myself sitting in a brightly lit studio, a large camera pointed at my face. I took a deep breath and I told my story. I didn't mention Ethan by name. I didn't need to. I spoke about the insidious pain of being betrayed by a loved one. I spoke about the way financial abuse often masquerades as love and concern. And I spoke about the power of finding your voice and fighting back. Not for revenge, but for dignity. Most importantly, I spoke about the Franklin Legacy Foundation and the incredible community of women who were turning their private pain into public purpose. The response was immediate and overwhelming. After the segment aired, our phone didn't stop ringing for 3 days. It was a testament to how many women were out there, suffering in silence, just waiting for a beacon of hope. I had found my true calling. My hands were steady as I opened the crisp, business-sized envelope from Ethan. There was no flicker of foolish hope for an apology, not anymore. That door had been closed and locked for good. I knew my son, or rather I knew the man he had become. A creature of pure, unadulterated narcissism. The letter was short, typed on expensive-looking letterhead, and as cold as a tombstone. It was from his new lawyer, a high-priced shark from a firm in Los Angeles. It was a formal cease and desist letter. He accused me of slandering the Miller family name and using private family matters for personal gain and public notoriety. He claimed my television appearance and the subsequent newspaper articles about the foundation had caused him severe emotional distress and irreparable professional harm. The letter, in no uncertain terms, demanded that I immediately stop all public speaking about my personal experiences and issue a public retraction, stating that the situation had been a private misunderstanding. If I refused, it stated, he would be forced to explore all legal options to protect his reputation. A thinly veiled threat of a defamation lawsuit. I read the letter twice, a bitter, humorless laugh bubbling up in my chest. A year ago, this letter would have devastated me. It would have sent me into a tailspin of guilt, fear, and self-doubt. Now I just felt tired. So incredibly tired of his endless games, his bottomless victimhood, his complete and utter inability to see beyond the narrow, selfish confines of his own world. He wasn't emotionally distressed. His colossal pride had been wounded. He wasn't a victim. He was an abuser, furious that his victim had not only refused to stay silent, but had dared to build a fortress for other victims. I was about to file the letter away in the ever-thickening Ethan folder when there was a soft knock at my office door at the foundation. It was Judith, a sweet, bird-like woman in her 70s who had been one of our very first clients. Her daughter, a charismatic and manipulative woman, had drained her entire life savings to fund a new business, then had convinced Judith that it was a gift she had offered and simply forgotten about. For months, Judith had been consumed by shame and confusion, believing she was losing her mind. Today she was beaming. Her eyes were bright, her posture straight. She was holding a small foil-covered basket that smelled heavenly of cinnamon and apples. "These are for you and Diane, Carol," she said, her voice stronger and clearer than I had ever heard it. "Apple muffins. My grandmother's recipe." She leaned in, her eyes shining with unshed, happy tears. "I saw you on the television the other night. You were so poised, so brave." She took my hand, her small, wrinkled one surprisingly strong. "After I saw you speak your truth, I finally did it. I called my other children, my sons who live out of state. I told them everything their sister did. I'm not going to be silent and protect her anymore." She squeezed my hand tightly. "You gave me my voice back, Carol. You made me feel like I wasn't crazy." I looked from Judith's radiant, hopeful face to the cold, threatening letter in my hand. One was a testament to healing, courage, and the power of shared truth. The other was the last, pathetic gasp of a failed tyrant. The choice, if you could even call it that, was clear. In that singular, clarifying moment, I knew exactly what I had to do. I stood up, walked over to the heavy-duty paper shredder in the corner of the office, and fed Ethan's letter into it. The machine whirred to life with a satisfying growl, turning his empty threats and legal jargon into a basketful of meaningless, confetti-like strips of paper. Judith looked at me, a questioning, amused smile on her face. "Just clearing out some old useless business," I said, and smiled back at her, a genuine heartfelt smile. In that moment I realized the final liberating truth. He could no longer hurt me. His words were just noise. His threats were just the impotent rage of a man who had lost all control. My legacy wasn't the vineyard or the house anymore. It was here in this room, in the fierce, beautiful eyes of the women I was so honored to help. It was a legacy of strength, resilience, and quiet, unshakable rebellion. And it was a legacy he could never ever touch. The last time I saw Ethan, it wasn't in a courtroom or across a lawyer's conference table. It was in the brightly lit, impersonal aisle of a grocery store, about a year after I had shredded his lawyer's letter. He looked thinner, and the expensive custom-tailored suit he wore seemed to hang off him, as if he had shrunk inside it. He was alone, staring intently at a display of imported cheeses. Our eyes met for a brief, jarring second across the refrigerated case. I saw a flicker of something in his expression, a flash of resentment, quickly followed by what looked like a hint of shame, before he quickly looked away, turning his attention back to the cheese with an intensity that was clearly feigned. I simply gave a small neutral nod, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than forgiveness, and continued pushing my cart down the aisle. There were no words exchanged. There was nothing left to say. The space between us was a canyon of his own making, a chasm too wide and too deep to ever be bridged. Sometimes silence is the only appropriate sentence. I eventually did sell the main vineyard house and a large portion of the surrounding land to a lovely young family who planned to continue its legacy. The house held too many painful memories, and it was simply too big, too empty for one person. The profits from that sale, which were substantial, were used to create a permanent, untouchable endowment for the Franklin Legacy Foundation, ensuring that it would be there to help women long after I was gone. I kept the original family plot, the one with the oldest, most gnarled vines, and a small, cozy cottage for myself. It was all I needed. The Carmel house, the one they had so brazenly tried to steal, has a new and beautiful life now. We call it Frank's Haven. It serves as a temporary, safe, and serene retreat for women who have had to leave their homes because of family abuse and have nowhere else to go. They can stay there for a few weeks, completely free of charge, to rest, regroup, and plan their next steps, with the constant soothing sound of the ocean as their companion. I go there often, not just to oversee things but to sit on the porch and share a cup of tea with the women who are staying there. We share stories. We cry. We laugh. We find strength in each other. My life is quiet now, but it is fuller and more meaningful than it has ever been. It is a life filled with purpose. The tight, painful knot of grief and betrayal that had taken up residence in my chest has finally dissolved, replaced by a steady, quiet peace. I learned the hardest, most painful lesson of my life. Sometimes the people you love the most are the ones who will hurt you the deepest. And I learned that letting go doesn't always feel like a triumphant victory. Sometimes it just feels like the quiet, solemn acceptance of what is, and the courage to build something new from the rubble. My legacy isn't in a bottle of wine or on a dusty century-old deed anymore. It's in the heartfelt, tear-stained thank you note from a woman who just won back her stolen pension. It's in the sound of roaring, healing laughter during a Friday afternoon support group meeting. It's in the look of profound relief on a woman's face when she realizes, for the first time, that she is believed, and that she finally has an army on her side. They thought they could erase me. They thought my worth was tied to a piece of paper, to a number in a bank account. But they were wrong. I rewrote my own story, not in ink, but in the lives of the women I was so deeply privileged to help. If you've ever felt like your voice was pushed aside, like your worth was tied to someone else's approval, I want you to sit with this story a moment longer. What would it look like to reclaim your peace without asking for permission? If this touched something in you, you're not alone. Share your thoughts below. Someone else might need to read your words tonight. Let's keep the conversation going for every woman rebuilding quietly, just like us. Thank you for listening.